Jack Mercer stood at the edge of the cliff, his eyes scanning the rugged terrain below. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the desperate cries for help that haunted his every step. He could see her now, a small figure clinging to the jagged rocks, her terrified eyes locked onto his. "Hold on. I'm coming," Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. He secured the rope around his waist and began his descent, each step sending a shower of loose stones tumbling into the abyss. The air grew colder the closer he got, the shadows deepening into an impenetrable blackness. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The girl's cries grew louder, more frantic, echoing off the canyon walls. "I'm almost there," Jack called out, his voice trembling with a mix of determination and fear. He reached out, his fingers just inches from hers, when the ground beneath him gave way. He plummeted, the rope snapping taut, and for a moment he was suspended in midair, the world spinning around him. The girl's face contorted in terror as she lost her grip, her scream piercing the night as she fell into the void. Jack's own scream mingled with hers, a sound of utter despair and helplessness before everything went black. Jack jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The echoes of the girl's screams still reverberated in his mind, a relentless reminder of his failure. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, the darkness of the cabin pressing in on him. "It's just a nightmare," he whispered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. But the guilt and the fear remained, gnawing at him, a constant presence that refused to be silenced. As he lay back down, staring at the ceiling, the whispers in the forest outside seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if calling him back to the horrors he had yet to face. Jack Mercer parked his old truck at the edge of the small town of Blackwood, West Virginia, a place where the mountains seemed to watch with silent judgment. The locals had already given him the once-over, cautious eyes peeking from behind curtains, wary glances from the porch of the general store. He was used to it. Small towns were always suspicious of outsiders, especially when they came asking questions about their darker history. Jack had been called here by the state search and rescue coordinator after the latest in a series of disappearances along the Vanishing Path, a notorious trail that seemed to swallow hikers whole. Official reports cited everything from wild animal attacks to fatal falls, but the sheer number of cases over the years hinted at something more sinister. He checked into the only motel in town, a rundown establishment with peeling paint and creaking floors. The owner, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, handed him a key without a word. Her silence was laden with unspoken warnings, but Jack was too tired to care. He needed rest, and then he needed to start his investigation. That night, he lay on the lumpy bed, staring at the stained ceiling. His mind drifted back to the nightmares that had plagued him for years, the failed rescue attempt that had cost a young girl her life. Her scream still echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of his limitations. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, but the whispers in the back of his mind only grew louder. The next morning, Jack drove to the local sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Pruitt was a grizzled man in his 60s, with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He greeted Jack with a firm handshake and a wary expression. "I appreciate you coming out here, Mercer," Pruitt said, leading him into a cluttered office. "We've had 3 hikers go missing in the past month alone. Every time we think we have a lead, it goes cold. Folks around here are scared." Jack nodded, glancing at the photos pinned to the wall. Faces of the missing stared back at him, young, old, male, female. There was no pattern, no clear connection between them except for the trail they had all taken. "I'll start at the trailhead," Jack said. "See if I can find anything the previous searches missed." Pruitt handed him a worn map. "Be careful out there. The terrain is rough. Folks around here talk about the Whisperer. Superstitious nonsense, if you ask me, but just be careful." Jack raised an eyebrow. "The Whisperer?" "Old legend," Pruitt replied, looking uncomfortable. "They say it's a spirit that lures people off the path, never to be seen again. Most of the locals won't go near that trail anymore." Jack pocketed the map and nodded. "Thanks for the heads up. I'll keep my ears open." As he left the sheriff's office, the sun was already high in the sky, casting long shadows across the town. Jack drove to the trailhead, a remote spot at the edge of the forest. The path was overgrown and barely visible, marked only by an old, weathered sign that read, Vanishing Path. He shouldered his pack, checked his gear, and set off down the trail. The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves put him on edge, but he forced himself to stay focused. A few miles in, he found the first sign of trouble. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, stained with blood. He examined it closely, noting the freshness of the blood and the jagged edges of the tear. Something, or someone, had been dragged off the path recently. As he continued deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers. He spotted more signs of struggle. Broken branches, disturbed underbrush, a scattering of personal items, a water bottle, a torn map, a single hiking boot. Then he heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. He stopped, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and his blood ran cold as he recognized the voice. It was the same voice from his nightmares, the young girl he had failed to save. "Help me, Jack," the voice whispered, echoing through the trees. "Help me!" Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, searching for the source. But there was nothing. Only the empty forest and the oppressive silence that followed. Shaken, he pressed on, determined to find answers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Jack stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. Its walls were covered in moss and ivy, the roof caved in from years of neglect. He approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, filled with the scent of decay. Jack's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a scene of chaos. Broken furniture, scattered papers, and dark stains on the floor. In the corner, he found a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. He flipped through it, recognizing the handwriting of the previous search and rescue officer. The journal detailed a chilling account of the Whisperer, a malevolent force that preyed on the fears of those who entered the forest. The officer's final entry was a scrawled plea for help, the ink smeared and frantic. Jack closed the journal, a cold dread settling in his gut. The Whisperer, whether real or a product of the mind, was out there, and it was watching him. He had come to find answers, but now he realized he was in over his head. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the cabin with their eerie chorus. Jack backed out of the cabin, his heart racing. He knew he couldn't turn back now. He had to find the source of the disappearances, to face whatever was out there. As night fell, Jack set up camp near the trail, his mind racing with thoughts of the Whisperer and the dark history of the Vanishing Path. The forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of the night, each noise a potential threat. He lay in his tent, the journal clutched in his hands, and tried to steel himself for the horrors that lay ahead. The whispers continued, a haunting reminder of the danger he faced. Jack knew he was being watched, that something in the forest was toying with him. But he also knew he had to keep going. For the missing hikers, for the young girl he had failed to save, and for himself. As he drifted into a restless sleep, the whispers seemed to merge with his dreams, pulling him deeper into the nightmare that had become his reality. And in the darkness, the Whisperer waited, ready to claim its next victim. Jack Mercer awoke to the faint light of dawn filtering through the trees. His dreams had been restless, filled with the same haunting whispers and shadowy figures that had plagued him since his arrival. He packed up his gear, determined to continue his search for answers, despite the gnawing fear that threatened to consume him. The trail grew more treacherous as he ventured deeper into the forest. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches, and the underbrush was thick with thorns that clawed at his clothing. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of decay and something else. Something he couldn't quite identify, but that set his nerves on edge. Jack moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. He spotted more signs of the missing hikers, a torn backpack, a shattered smartphone, and scraps of clothing caught on branches. Each discovery was a grim reminder of the dangers lurking in the shadows. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing denser and the light dimming to an eerie twilight. Jack's unease grew with each step, the whispers in the back of his mind becoming more insistent. He tried to shake them off, focusing on the task at hand, but they refused to be silenced. Late in the afternoon, Jack came across a small clearing. In the center stood a large, ancient tree, its gnarled branches twisting into the sky like skeletal fingers. The ground around the tree was disturbed, the soil freshly turned. As he approached, he noticed something sticking out of the dirt. A fragment of bone, weathered and stained. Jack knelt down, his heart pounding as he brushed away the soil. The remains were human, partially decomposed and scattered as if something, or someone, had tried to conceal them. He recognized the remnants of a hiker's clothing and the tattered remains of a tent nearby. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had found one of the missing hikers, or at least what was left of them. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if urging him to leave. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But he forced himself to stay. He had to document what he had found, to bring back proof of the horrors lurking in these woods. As he took photographs and made notes, the air grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jack's breath came in visible puffs, his fingers growing numb with the chill. He glanced around nervously, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a figure darting between the trees. He turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. The whispers intensified, swirling around him like a storm. Panic clawed at his mind, but he forced himself to remain calm. He finished his work quickly, packing up his gear and preparing to leave the clearing. But as he turned to go, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating the ghastly face of a young girl, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me, Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, help me." Jack's heart stopped. It was the girl from his nightmares, the one he had failed to save. He reached out to touch her, but his hand passed through her as if she were made of mist. She vanished, leaving only the cold, empty air behind. The forest seemed to come alive with whispers, the voices blending together into a cacophony of fear and despair. Jack stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He had to get out of here, to find safety and regroup. He turned and ran, the whispers chasing him through the trees. The forest seemed to twist and warp around him, the path becoming a labyrinth of shadows and terror. Branches reached out like grasping hands, tearing at his clothes and skin. The ground was slick with mud and blood, making every step a struggle. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to keep his footing. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for his spare, the beam cutting through the night just in time to reveal a sheer drop ahead. He skidded to a halt, teetering on the edge of the cliff. He looked back, expecting to see the ghostly figure of the girl, or the malevolent entity the locals called the Whisperer. But there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness and the echo of his own heartbeat. Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't let fear control him. He had to find a way out, to survive and bring back proof of the horrors he had witnessed. He edged away from the cliff, carefully retracing his steps. The journey back to his campsite was a blur of fear and exhaustion. The whispers never ceased, following him like a relentless shadow. By the time he reached the relative safety of his tent, he was shaking with cold and terror. He collapsed inside, his mind racing. He had found evidence of the missing hikers, but he had also encountered something far more sinister, something that defied explanation. The whispers, the ghostly apparition, the sense of being watched. It all pointed to a malevolent presence in the woods. As he lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the tent's ceiling, Jack knew he couldn't turn back now. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The lives of the missing hikers depended on it, and so did his own sanity. The whispers continued to haunt him, a constant reminder of the darkness that awaited him in the heart of the forest. But Jack was determined to face it head-on, to confront the horrors lurking in the shadows and bring them into the light. Jack Mercer woke up to the chilling morning air, his breath visible in the dim light filtering through the forest canopy. The previous day's discoveries weighed heavily on his mind, but he couldn't let fear paralyze him. He had come here to find answers, and he wouldn't leave until he did. Packing up his gear, Jack set off deeper into the forest. The path ahead was treacherous, but he moved with a determined focus, carefully navigating the uneven terrain. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the day wore on, Jack noticed subtle changes in his surroundings. The trees grew thicker and more twisted, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and the scent of decay became more pronounced. The whispers, which had been a distant murmur, grew louder, more insistent. He came across another clearing, this one even more disturbing than the last. The ground was littered with bones, some bleached white by the sun, others still bearing scraps of flesh. Personal items lay scattered among the remains. A torn backpack, a shattered phone, a watch with a cracked face. Jack's stomach churned at the sight, but he forced himself to examine the scene closely. As he sifted through the remains, he found a small notebook, its pages stained with blood and dirt. The writing inside was frantic, almost illegible, but he managed to make out a few words: whispers, shadows, and trapped. The final entry was a single desperate plea: help us. Jack's hands shook as he closed the notebook. These people had died in terror. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if urging him deeper into the forest. Jack followed them, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground was slick with mud and blood. As he ventured further, Jack began to see ghostly figures flitting between the trees. At first, they were just glimpses out of the corner of his eye. A flash of movement, a shadow that shouldn't be there. But as he pressed on, the apparitions grew more frequent, more tangible. He saw faces twisted in agony, hands reaching out in desperation, eyes filled with fear. The forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of the dead. He heard screams and cries for help, the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches. Each sound sent a jolt of fear through him, but he forced himself to keep moving. Then, he heard a voice, clear and distinct, cutting through the cacophony of whispers. It was the voice of the girl from his nightmares, the one he had failed to save. "Jack, please help me," she cried, her voice filled with desperation. Jack's heart raced as he followed the sound, his flashlight beam dancing across the twisted trunks and tangled underbrush. He stumbled into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive ancient tree. Its gnarled branches twisted into the sky, and its trunk was scarred with deep, jagged cuts. At the base of the tree, he saw her, the girl, her spectral form flickering in the dim light. She looked just as she had in his nightmares, her eyes wide with fear, her hands clutching at the air. "Please, Jack," she whispered, "help me." Jack reached out to her, but his hand passed through her form, leaving only the cold, empty air behind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices. He staggered back, clutching his head, trying to block out the sound. "Help us!" the voices cried, blending together into a single desperate plea. Jack fell to his knees, his mind reeling. He felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, and he looked up to see the ghostly figure of the girl standing over him. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, and her mouth moved as if to speak, but no sound came out. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and Jack looked around in panic. The tree's roots writhed and twisted, breaking through the soil like the limbs of some monstrous creature. The whispers reached a fever pitch, drowning out all other sounds. Jack struggled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out of there, to find some way to escape the forest and the horrors that lurked within it. He turned and ran, the whispers chasing him through the trees. The forest seemed to twist and warp around him, the path becoming a labyrinth of shadows and terror. Branches reached out like grasping hands, tearing at his clothes and skin. The ground was slick with mud and blood, making every step a struggle. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to keep his footing. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for his spare, the beam cutting through the night just in time to reveal a sheer drop ahead. He skidded to a halt, teetering on the edge of the cliff. He looked back, expecting to see the ghostly figures, or the malevolent entity the locals called the Whisperer. But there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness and the echo of his own heartbeat. Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't let fear control him. He had to find a way out, to survive, and bring back proof of the horrors he had witnessed. He edged away from the cliff, carefully retracing his steps. The journey back to his campsite was a blur of fear and exhaustion. The whispers never ceased, following him like a relentless shadow. By the time he reached the relative safety of his tent, he was shaking with cold and terror. He collapsed inside, his mind racing. He had found evidence of the missing hikers, but he had also encountered something far more sinister, something that defied explanation. The whispers, the ghostly apparitions, the sense of being watched. It all pointed to a malevolent presence in the woods. As he lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the tent's ceiling, Jack knew he couldn't turn back now. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The lives of the missing hikers depended on it, and so did his own sanity. The whispers continued to haunt him, a constant reminder of the darkness that awaited him in the heart of the forest. But Jack was determined to face it head-on, to confront the horrors lurking in the shadows and bring them into the light. Jack Mercer awoke before dawn, the darkness outside his tent a thick, oppressive presence. The forest was unnaturally still, as if it, too, awaited something terrible. He packed his gear methodically, his movements steady, despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Today, he would venture to the heart of the forest, to the place where the whispers seemed to originate. The trail ahead was almost indistinguishable, overgrown and treacherous. Jack moved carefully, each step a cautious advance into the unknown. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches creating a canopy that blocked out the sky. The deeper he went, the colder and darker it became, until it felt like he was moving through a different world altogether. As the morning light struggled to penetrate the thick foliage, Jack stumbled upon a small stream. He knelt to drink, the icy water a brief respite from the oppressive atmosphere. As he splashed his face, he noticed something peculiar in the water's reflection. A flicker of movement, too swift to be a trick of the light. He stood up quickly, scanning the surrounding forest. There, just beyond the tree line, he saw it, a figure, pale and ethereal, watching him. It was the girl from his nightmares, her eyes wide and pleading. She raised a hand, beckoning him to follow. Heart pounding, Jack moved toward her, the whispers growing louder with each step. She led him deeper into the forest. He followed her through dense underbrush and over rocky terrain, the path growing steeper and more perilous. Finally, they reached an ancient, abandoned cabin, half hidden by the encroaching forest. The girl stopped at the entrance, her form wavering as if she were struggling to remain solid. Jack approached cautiously, his flashlight casting long shadows on the weathered wood. Inside, the cabin was a scene of chaos. The floor was littered with broken furniture, tattered clothing, and dark stains that spoke of violence. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers were almost deafening now, a chorus of agony that echoed off the walls. In the center of the room lay a trapdoor, partially concealed by a rotting rug. Jack hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn back, but he couldn't ignore the desperate plea in the girl's eyes. He pulled the door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. With a deep breath, Jack descended into the cellar, his flashlight illuminating the way. The air grew colder with each step, the whispers louder and more insistent. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the stone. In the center of the room stood an altar, stained with blood and surrounded by the remains of the missing hikers. Jack's stomach churned at the sight, but he forced himself to move closer. As he examined the altar, he felt a presence behind him. He turned to see the girl standing at the edge of the room, her eyes filled with sorrow. She pointed to a corner of the chamber, where a large, ornate mirror stood. Jack approached the mirror, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. As he wiped it clean, the whispers reached a fever pitch, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices. He stared into the mirror, his reflection twisted and distorted, the faces of the dead appearing behind him. Suddenly the mirror shattered, the shards flying through the air. Jack shielded his face, the glass cutting into his skin. When he looked up, he saw a figure emerging from the darkness, a grotesque, shifting mass of shadows and screams, the embodiment of all the fear and despair that had permeated the forest. The entity moved toward him, its form constantly changing, a swirling vortex of agony. Jack backed away, his mind racing. He had to find a way to fight it, to banish it from this place and end its reign of terror. As the entity approached, Jack felt a surge of defiance. He grabbed a shard of the broken mirror, its edge sharp and deadly. The whispers grew louder, almost overwhelming, but he focused on the faces of the missing hikers, on the girl who had led him here. He couldn't let their deaths be in vain. With a primal scream, Jack lunged at the entity, plunging the shard into its shifting form. The entity shrieked, a sound of pure agony, and began to dissolve, the shadows dissipating into the air. The whispers grew fainter, then fell silent. Jack collapsed to the ground, exhausted and bleeding. The room was quiet now, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. He looked around, the faces of the dead no longer haunting him. The girl stood before him, her form solid and at peace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "You freed us." Jack nodded, tears streaming down his face. He had done it. He had faced the darkness and won. The girl smiled, her form slowly fading until she was gone. Jack made his way back up the stairs, the morning light filtering through the cabin's broken windows. He stepped outside, the forest no longer feeling hostile and oppressive. The air was fresh, the whispers silenced. As he walked back to his campsite, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had uncovered the truth, faced the horrors lurking in the shadows, and brought them into the light. The lives of the missing hikers had not been lost in vain, and he had finally found a measure of redemption for his own past failures. The forest seemed to breathe, a sigh of relief. The weight of its dark history lifted. Jack knew he would never forget what he had seen, but he also knew he had the strength to move forward. The nightmares might still come, but he had faced the worst of them and survived. As he packed up his gear and prepared to leave, Jack took one last look at the forest. The trees stood tall and silent, the shadows no longer menacing. He had conquered his fears and brought peace to the restless spirits. And as he walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Jack Mercer trekked through the forest, his mind clearer than it had been in days. The morning light revealed a path ahead, one that seemed to beckon him toward the heart of the woods. As he moved deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the shadows lengthening as if reaching out to him. The whispers returned, no longer desperate but filled with malice. Jack gritted his teeth, determined not to let fear control him. He had faced the darkness before, and he would do it again. Hours passed, the forest growing denser and more foreboding. Jack came across another clearing, dominated by a large rock formation that looked almost like a natural altar. The ground around it was littered with bones and remnants of past victims. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized this place was a focal point of the evil that had plagued the forest. As he approached the altar, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. He felt a cold wind on his face, carrying with it the scent of decay. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and the trees around him groaned as if in pain. Then, from the shadows, the entity emerged. It was no longer a shifting mass of shadows, but had taken on a more defined form. A grotesque figure, towering and skeletal, with hollow eyes that burned with an unnatural light. It was the embodiment of the forest's darkest fears, a creature born from centuries of pain and suffering. Jack stood his ground, gripping the shard of the mirror he had carried with him. The entity moved closer, its presence suffocating, the whispers becoming a deafening roar. He felt the cold grip of terror, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the faces of the people he had come to save. "Why do you torment these woods?" Jack shouted, his voice echoing off the trees. "What do you want?" The entity paused, its hollow eyes fixed on him. "They are mine," it whispered, its voice a chorus of agony. "Their fear, their pain, it feeds me, and now you will join them." With a scream, the entity lunged at Jack, its form shifting and writhing. He dodged to the side, slashing at it with the mirror shard. The creature recoiled, a shriek of pain echoing through the forest. Jack pressed his advantage, striking again and again, each blow weakening the entity. The ground shook, the trees swaying as if caught in a violent storm. Jack felt a surge of determination, his fear replaced by a burning resolve. He had to end this, to free the forest and its victims from the entity's grasp. The entity lashed out, its skeletal hand striking Jack and sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to stand. The creature loomed over him, its eyes burning with rage. Jack gripped the shard tightly, waiting for the right moment. As the entity moved in for the kill, Jack saw his chance. He lunged forward, plunging the shard deep into the creature's chest. The entity screamed, a sound of pure torment, its form dissolving into shadows. The whispers reached a fever pitch, then fell silent as the creature disintegrated into nothingness. Jack collapsed to the ground, exhausted and bleeding. The forest was eerily silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. He lay there for a moment, catching his breath, before forcing himself to stand. The clearing around the altar was now peaceful, the bones and remnants of past victims slowly crumbling to dust. Jack knew he had done it. He had defeated the entity and freed the forest from its curse. But as he took a step forward, a sharp pain pierced his chest. He looked down to see the shard of the mirror, slick with blood, still embedded in his hand. The adrenaline that had carried him through the battle faded, and the full extent of his injuries became painfully clear. Jack fell to his knees, the world spinning around him. The forest, once a place of terror, seemed to close in, the trees whispering his name. He had saved the others, but he knew he wouldn't make it out alive. As the darkness closed in, Jack felt a strange sense of peace. He had done what he came to do. He had faced his fears and confronted the horrors that had haunted him. The forest had taken him, but he had left it better than he had found it. With his last breath, Jack whispered a prayer for the souls he had freed, and then the world went black.